The flames roared like a wild animal, tearing through the mansion with a ferocity that seemed unstoppable. Smoke filled the air, and the smell of burning wood and fabric was thick, choking anyone who dared to breathe. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and grandeur, was now nothing more than an inferno, threatening to consume everything in its path. Inside, trapped on the second floor, was a young woman, terrified, struggling to breathe, as she frantically searched for a way out. Her name was Emily Harper, the only daughter of one of the richest men in the city. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Her title, her wealth, the servants that usually catered to her every whim, none of it could help her now. She was just a girl who found herself in the most terrifying situation of her life. The flames were closing in, the smoke suffocating her, and time was running out. There was only one way out of this, and that was through the window. But as she reached for the frame, her legs buckled beneath her, and she realized she was too weak to escape alone. And then, just when hope seemed lost, a shadow appeared in the doorway. A figure, no more than a teenager, burst into the room with a determination in his eyes. His name was Liam Turner, and though he was just a poor boy from the other side of town, in that moment, he was her only chance. He had no reason to be in the Harper mansion that day, he had no connection to the family, no reason to risk his life, but there he was, a complete stranger, ready to do what others couldn't or wouldn't. "Grab my hand!" Liam shouted, his voice firm, cutting through the chaos. Emily, her heart racing, barely had time to comprehend what was happening. She was in shock, struggling to focus as the smoke thickened and the heat intensified. But Liam wasn't waiting. He reached for her, lifting her with an ease that belied the situation, and in one swift motion, he helped her to the window. Without a second thought, Liam pulled her from the ledge and into his arms, jumping from the second story with a terrifying leap. They hit the ground hard, but Emily was alive. And so was he. As they lay there, gasping for air, Liam didn't seem to hesitate. There was no gratitude in his expression, no relief. Instead, there was only a cold determination, a look that suggested he had planned this moment his entire life. The fire raged on, but the immediate danger had passed. Liam helped Emily to her feet, and the moment they were out of the danger zone, her first words to him were barely audible but filled with disbelief. "Why did you do this?" Liam didn't answer at first. His eyes seemed distant, as if he were processing something, weighing the consequences. But then, without warning, he turned to face her. "I need something from your father," he said, his voice sharp, demanding. "And I'm not leaving until I get it." Emily was speechless. Her mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. This boy, this stranger, had just saved her life, and now he was asking for something in return. What could he possibly want from her father, the millionaire who owned more than most people could ever dream of? For a moment, there was silence. Liam stood, his posture unyielding, as if expecting her to understand, to accept his words. But Emily was still stunned. "What are you talking about? What could you possibly want from my father?" Liam's gaze hardened. "I'll tell you. But not now. Not yet." Emily looked at him, unsure of what to say or do next. Her heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had just narrowly escaped death, and yet here she was, facing a boy who had saved her life but was now demanding something from her father in return. The situation was bizarre, terrifying, and confusing all at once. What could Liam possibly want that was so important, so pressing, that he was willing to risk everything for it? Was he just another opportunist, using her misfortune to get what he wanted? Or was there something more to his story, a hidden reason that explained why he was willing to go to such extremes for someone he didn't even know? As Emily's mind raced with questions, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. The fire department had arrived, and soon, the whole area would be swarming with reporters, firefighters, and possibly even her father's security team. Liam didn't seem worried. He turned and started walking toward the street, moving quickly, as if he had a destination in mind. "Where are you going?" Emily called after him, her voice shaky but demanding an answer. He didn't stop. "I'm not finished yet," he called over his shoulder. But Emily wasn't about to let him go. Not like this. Not without knowing what he wanted, why he had done it. She ran after him, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground, her heart still racing from the events of the last few minutes. "Wait," she shouted. "What do you want from my father? What do you need?" Liam slowed down just enough to glance back at her, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You'll find out soon enough," he said cryptically, before disappearing into the crowd of first responders and emergency vehicles. Emily stopped in her tracks, breathless, as she watched him slip away. What had just happened? Was he really just a good Samaritan? Or was this all part of a larger plan, a scheme that she couldn't yet comprehend? One thing was certain, her life had just changed forever. And Liam Turner, the poor boy who had saved her life, was at the center of it all. The sirens wailed, the flashing red lights of the fire trucks casting an eerie glow over the wreckage. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her mind still reeling from the bizarre chain of events. The mansion, her family's prized possession, was reduced to nothing more than a burning skeleton, the flames licking the sky in a dance of destruction. Yet amidst the chaos, one thought kept circling in her mind: who was Liam Turner? She had barely known him for a few minutes, but somehow, in those precious seconds, he had become the one person who had completely changed the course of her life. He had saved her, yes, but at what cost? And what did he want in return? Her mind wouldn't let go of the questions, and she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something far deeper was at play. The fire department quickly took control of the situation, and emergency responders began to manage the aftermath of the fire. They focused on the immediate needs, rescuing anyone who might still be trapped, assessing the damage, and trying to prevent the fire from spreading further. The reporters, of course, were already there, scribbling down notes, snapping photos, and shouting questions at anyone they could. Emily could see her father's bodyguards moving toward the scene as well, their sharp eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Her father's mansion was burning to the ground, and she was standing there in the middle of it all, the air thick with smoke, the ground beneath her feet still warm from the flames. The sounds of people shouting, the crackle of the fire, and the frantic energy of the scene overwhelmed her senses. But in the midst of it all, one question remained: where had Liam gone? Emily's eyes scanned the crowd again, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy who had risked everything to save her. But he was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the commotion, leaving only the memory of his sudden appearance and his strange demand. She shook her head, trying to focus. She had to find him. She had to know what he wanted. "Miss Harper," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see one of her father's security guards approaching her, his face drawn with concern. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded absently, still scanning the area. "I'm fine. But I need to know something. Where did he go?" "The boy. Liam Turner." The guard seemed taken aback by the question. He didn't know who Liam was, of course, he wasn't even supposed to be here, not in a place like this. But something in Emily's voice must have told him that this wasn't just some casual inquiry. "I'm sorry, miss," the guard said. "I haven't seen him. Maybe one of the officers has spoken to him. We can look into it." But Emily didn't need an officer or a security guard to find Liam. She could do this on her own. She had to. Her mind was set on one thing: finding the answers to the questions that had been building up in her since the fire. What did Liam Turner want from her father? And why did he go to such lengths to save her? As she moved through the crowd, she could feel the weight of her father's wealth pressing down on her. The estate, the company, the empire, none of it could protect her from the fact that she had just become entangled in something far bigger than herself. She had no idea what that something was yet, but she was determined to find out. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts. Emily turned quickly, expecting to see a member of the security team or perhaps one of her father's business associates, but instead, there he was again, Liam. He had somehow managed to slip past everyone, blending into the crowd like a shadow. She froze, unsure whether to confront him or simply let him walk away. But before she could make up her mind, Liam spoke, his voice low, just loud enough for her to hear over the noise of the scene. "You're still looking for me, huh?" he said with a knowing smirk. Emily's heart raced. She wasn't sure whether to feel relief or confusion. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "What do you want from my father? What's your game here?" Liam didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face, as though weighing her every reaction. For a moment, there was a long silence between them, the sounds of the fire and the chaos of the scene fading into the background. "I'm not here to make a deal with your father," he said finally, his voice cold, but carrying an edge of something more than just a simple desire for money or power. "I don't care about his wealth. I'm here for something much more important than that." Emily blinked, trying to process his words. Not about his wealth? What could he possibly want if not money or power? She searched his eyes, trying to find some clue as to what he was talking about, but they were dark, unreadable. For a moment, she felt as though she were staring into a void. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Liam's lips twitched, but the smirk didn't quite reach his eyes. "I can't tell you everything, not yet. But you'll find out soon enough. Trust me, Miss Harper, you're in this now. You're already involved." Emily's stomach tightened at the words. "Involved in what?" she asked, a sense of dread creeping into her chest. But Liam didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel and began to walk away, disappearing into the crowd once again. Emily stood there, rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest. The fire, the smoke, the destruction, it all seemed distant now. All she could think about was the boy who had saved her life, the boy who seemed to hold the key to something far darker than she could understand. As the fire continued to burn in the distance, Emily knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. Whatever Liam Turner was planning, whatever he wanted from her father, it wasn't going to be easy. And she had a feeling that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The tension was thick in the air. And as she glanced back at the smoldering ruins of the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As Emily stood there, the weight of Liam's cryptic words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The fire that had destroyed her family's mansion now seemed almost secondary to the riddle he had left behind. She had come so close to losing her life only moments ago, and now, standing in the middle of the wreckage, she was faced with the unsettling realization that her encounter with Liam was far from over. What did he mean by "you're already involved"? Involved in what? She tried to push the thought away, but it lingered in her mind like a shadow, dark and foreboding. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something far larger was at play. It wasn't just the fire. It was something about Liam, something hidden beneath his calm exterior. Her gaze drifted back to the smoldering remains of the mansion. Her father's wealth, his legacy, everything they had worked for, was now reduced to ash. She had never imagined that her life could be turned upside down in the span of a single evening. It wasn't just about the house or the riches anymore. This fire, this strange encounter with Liam, it felt like the start of something bigger. Something darker. Emily felt a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to see one of her father's security guards standing beside her, a look of concern on his face. His name was Marco, and he had worked for her family for years. He was a solid presence, always calm, always professional, but tonight he looked different. There was an unease in his eyes that Emily couldn't ignore. "Miss Harper," Marco said quietly, his voice heavy with concern, "we need to get you out of here. It's not safe." Emily nodded absently, her mind still preoccupied with thoughts of Liam. Marco guided her toward a black SUV parked a little ways from the scene, away from the flashing lights and growing crowd of reporters. The vehicle was part of her father's private security detail, and it was equipped with everything they needed for situations like this. Emily didn't resist. She had learned long ago to trust Marco's judgment, but tonight, nothing seemed normal. The world she had known, the comfortable life she had grown up in, felt increasingly distant. As she settled into the back seat of the SUV, the familiar hum of the engine offered little comfort. The city lights passed by in a blur as they drove away from the fire. The mansion, the place she had called home for so long, was quickly fading into the distance. Marco's eyes remained on the rearview mirror, scanning for anything unusual. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Emily stared out the window, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore the one question that had been plaguing her: why was Liam involved? After a few minutes of silence, Marco finally spoke, his tone low, as if he were weighing every word before he spoke it. "I've heard things," he began cautiously. "About that boy. Liam Turner." Emily's head snapped toward him, her interest piqued. "What do you mean? Who is he?" Marco hesitated before answering, his eyes briefly meeting hers in the mirror. "He's not just some random kid, Miss Harper. His family, they don't have much, but they've been around here for a while. They've been struggling, but I've heard whispers. People say there's more to him than meets the eye." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of whispers?" "Whispers of trouble. Of things that go beyond just a bad upbringing." Marco paused, his voice tightening as he added, "I don't know all the details, but there are rumors. Some say Liam's father is tied to some unsavory people. Maybe not directly, but somehow. People like that don't just disappear, Miss Harper. They leave their mark." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She had no idea what kind of world Liam had come from, but now, with the weight of Marco's words sinking in, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of how deep the fall might be. Could it be true? Was Liam involved with dangerous people? Or was he just a kid who got caught up in something he didn't understand? "Then why would he save me?" Emily whispered, more to herself than to Marco. The question felt too big, too confusing, to answer. Marco didn't respond right away. He glanced at her through the mirror again, his face a mask of worry. "I don't know. Maybe he wants something from your father. Something more than just money. Maybe he's trying to use you to get it." Emily's thoughts whirled. Trying to use me, the idea unsettled her, but it didn't quite fit. If Liam had wanted something from her father, he could have taken it by now. But he hadn't. He had saved her, risking his own life without hesitation. And then he had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions. The SUV turned down a side street, and Emily barely noticed the change in direction. She was lost in her thoughts, piecing together the fragments of the night. Something about Liam didn't add up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that his actions were part of something much bigger than just a rescue. He was hiding something, she was sure of it. When they arrived at the small, nondescript building where her father's private residence was located, Marco helped Emily out of the car and guided her inside. It was a far cry from the grandeur of the mansion, but it offered safety, privacy. The building was secure, surrounded by high gates and surveillance cameras. Emily had spent more time here than she could count, and for the first time, it felt like a sanctuary. But even as she stepped inside, she couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around her. She was safe, physically. But emotionally? Mentally? How could she feel safe when she didn't know what was happening? The door clicked shut behind her, and she turned to face Marco, who was now watching her closely. "Miss Harper, I'll stay close tonight. You shouldn't be alone after what happened." Emily nodded, but her mind wasn't on the comfort of her bodyguard. She couldn't stop thinking about Liam, about the strange feeling he had left her with. He was in control of something, something bigger than her father's wealth or the fire that had destroyed their home. He wasn't just a poor boy who had stumbled into a moment of heroism. There was a plan, and Emily had no idea what role she played in it. But she knew, deep down, that she had no choice but to figure it out. She turned to Marco, her voice firm despite the uncertainty that gripped her. "We need to find him. I need to understand why he saved me and what he wants from my family." Marco's face softened, but his concern was still evident. "It's not going to be easy, Miss Harper. People like Liam don't just walk away from their past. Whatever he's after, it won't be simple. And it might be dangerous." Emily didn't flinch. She had no choice but to face whatever was coming. The fire had been just the beginning, and now, the real story was about to unfold. The hours that followed were a blur of restless thoughts and unanswered questions. Emily couldn't sleep, her mind racing as she turned over every detail of that night. The fire, the rescue, the strange words Liam had left behind, all of it felt like a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the darkened city below. The world seemed to have moved on, but Emily was stuck in the past, haunted by the inexplicable encounter with the boy who had saved her life. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was nearly 3 a.m., and still, there was no sign of Liam. No phone calls. No messages. Nothing. Her thoughts kept returning to one nagging question: what does he want? The words he had spoken were simple enough, but they didn't make any sense. He had saved her, only to demand something in return. But what was it? And why didn't he just ask for whatever it was he needed instead of playing these games? Emily could feel her frustration mounting. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Her father's empire, built over decades, had seemed invincible. But tonight had shattered that illusion, and she had a sinking feeling that the fire wasn't the worst thing that would come for them. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling her out of her thoughts. She reached for it quickly, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the name on the screen: Marco. She answered without hesitation. "Miss Harper, I think you should come downstairs," Marco said, his voice tight, though he was trying to mask the tension. "There's someone here to see you." "Who?" Emily asked, her pulse quickening. The last thing she expected was someone showing up at this hour. "I don't know, Mississippi. But he's demanding to speak with you. He's not like anyone I've ever seen. And he's not taking no for an answer." Her stomach churned. It could only be one person. She felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. "Liam." "Send him away," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. "We don't need anyone right now." "I can't do that," Marco replied. "You need to hear him out. Trust me, you'll want to." Emily hesitated for a moment, then stood. The decision was made. She knew this encounter wasn't something she could avoid. Marco was right. She couldn't run from whatever was unfolding. The truth would come to her, whether she was ready for it or not. As she descended the stairs, the house felt eerily quiet. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of footsteps in the hall were the only noises. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, and with each step she took toward the foyer, the sense of dread grew. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, she saw Marco standing at the door, his posture tense. There, standing just outside the threshold, was Liam Turner. He looked different than the boy she had seen earlier that night. Gone was the urgency, the desperation of a boy who had just performed a daring rescue. Now, Liam stood with a calm confidence, his eyes sharp and calculating. His clothes were no longer tattered or smoky from the fire. Instead, he wore a dark jacket and jeans, looking like someone who belonged in a place far more upscale than where he stood now. But it was his presence that caught Emily's attention. There was something in his eyes, something dangerous. The kind of intensity that made her heart race. Liam didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his gaze never leaving Emily's. "I told you we'd meet again," he said, his voice cool, almost amused. Marco looked at Emily, unsure whether he should intervene. Emily took a breath and nodded to him. "It's all right, Marco. Let him speak." Marco hesitated but then moved to stand just behind her, his protective instincts still on high alert. Emily met Liam's gaze, but she didn't back down. She had questions, and tonight, she would get answers. "Why are you here, Liam?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want?" Liam gave her a long, deliberate look, as though deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his tone low and quiet. "I told you before. You're involved now. Whether you like it or not." Emily crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You've said that. What does that even mean? What are you trying to tell me?" Liam stepped closer, his eyes glinting with something that felt like a warning. "Your father has enemies, Emily. People who would do anything to see him fall. People who don't care about the rules. And when you're at the top, when you have everything to lose, that's when you become a target." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "My father isn't. He's not involved in anything like that. He's a businessman. He's worked hard for everything we have." Liam's lips curled into a half-smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think I'm talking about business? Your father's empire is just a facade. It's what people see on the surface. But underneath? There's a lot more going on than you realize. Dangerous people are watching. And they're getting closer." Emily could feel the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying? Are you threatening my family?" "No," Liam said sharply. "I'm warning you. Your family is already in danger. The fire wasn't an accident. It was just a message." The words hit her like a blow. Her family's home, the one place she thought would always be safe, had been targeted. She hadn't considered the possibility of something more sinister, something deliberate behind the flames. But now, with Liam's words hanging in the air, the truth felt much more real. "Why would anyone target us?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam's gaze softened for the briefest moment, as if there was something more he wanted to say. But then he hardened again. "Because your father is a pawn in a much larger game. And you, Emily, you're caught in the middle of it." Emily's pulse raced. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The night had begun with a simple fire, an unlikely hero, and a strange demand. But now, it had spiraled into something much more dangerous, something that threatened everything she had known. Liam took a step back, his expression unreadable. "I didn't come here for you to trust me," he said quietly. "I came here to make sure you understood what's at stake. Your father may be able to protect his wealth. He may be able to protect his name. But he can't protect you forever." The words hung in the air between them, charged with an ominous energy. Emily felt the ground beneath her shift, her world tilting as everything she knew began to unravel. She had always been the daughter of a powerful man, surrounded by luxury and privilege. But now, standing in front of a boy who had saved her life and thrown her into the heart of a danger she hadn't seen coming, Emily realized she was no longer living in the world she once knew. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. Liam paused for a moment, studying her. Then, with a cold glint in his eyes, he gave his answer. "Because you're the key." The words echoed in Emily's mind, bouncing off the walls of the silent room. You're the key. The weight of the statement crushed her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. What did Liam mean? What did he know that she didn't? She was just a daughter, a girl who had been saved by a stranger. A boy from the wrong side of town, with nothing to his name but a quiet determination and a sense of purpose that was as unsettling as it was confusing. Liam stood across the room from her, his eyes never leaving her face. He was waiting for her to process his words, for her to understand what he was implying. But Emily couldn't make sense of it. She had spent her entire life sheltered in privilege, with a father who had always been there to protect her, to provide for her. She'd never had to worry about danger, not in the way that Liam was talking about. "You're the key to what?" Emily finally managed to ask, her voice thick with disbelief. Liam stepped closer, his presence both commanding and unsettling. "To your father's future. To his empire. To his survival." His words were quiet but cutting, each one landing like a weight. "The people I'm talking about, they don't care about what your father built. They care about control. They'll do anything to gain it. And they'll use anyone who's close to him to get what they want." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Control, the idea made her skin crawl. She had always thought of her father's business as a fortress, unassailable, powerful, and untouchable. But now, Liam's words painted a much different picture. A picture of power, manipulation, and darkness. A picture of people who didn't play by the same rules, people who would tear everything down for the sake of their own gain. "Why are you telling me this?" Emily asked, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't decide if Liam was helping her or using her for his own gain. Liam's gaze softened for a brief moment, as though he could see the confusion in her eyes. "Because you have no idea what's coming, Emily. And because you're involved whether you want to be or not. They'll come for you. They'll come for your family, for your father's connections. And when they do, they'll use you as leverage. They'll make you believe it's for your own good." Emily's thoughts spun wildly. The night had already shaken her world to its core. The fire, the rescue, and now this revelation that everything she had known was built on fragile ground. Her father's company, his reputation, his wealth, it all seemed so solid, so unshakable. But now, it felt like the pieces of her life were crumbling, slipping through her fingers. The thought of people using her as leverage made her feel small, powerless. But what could she do? How could she fight back against something so massive, so insidious? "What are you suggesting, Liam?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "That I should just walk away from everything? From my father? From my life?" "No," Liam said, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm not asking you to walk away. I'm asking you to face the truth. Your father's business isn't what you think it is. And the people who control it aren't who you think they are either." The words felt like a punch to her gut. She had grown up with a father who was admired by his peers, respected by his colleagues. The idea that his business was tangled up in anything unsavory seemed impossible. But Liam's words had the sting of truth. Something about the way he spoke, so calm, so assured, made her doubt the comfortable life she had always known. Liam's expression hardened. The fire was just the beginning. The people I'm talking about, they don't make mistakes. They've been watching your father for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. They know his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities. And they've been planning this for a long time. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. You said I was the key. What do you mean by that? Liam's eyes flickered, the first sign of emotion she'd seen in him since he'd walked in. He didn't immediately answer, but she saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't just talking about her father's empire. He was talking about something personal. Something dangerous. You're the key because you're the one they want, Liam said, his voice low. You're the one who can break your father. They know that you're the most important thing in his life. And once they have you, they can control him. They can control everything. Emily recoiled, her heart sinking as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together. They wanted her. Her father's weakness wasn't just his business, it was her. The idea was horrifying, and yet, it made a strange kind of sense. She was his only daughter, the heir to everything he had built. If someone wanted to destroy him, the most effective way would be to target her. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. No, that's not true. My father would never, he wouldn't let anything happen to me. Liam's eyes darkened, and he took another step closer. You don't know your father like I do. People like him, they make enemies. And enemies have ways of getting what they want. Emily's mind raced, spinning in circles as the realization set in. She had always admired her father's strength, his ability to build an empire from nothing. But now, she was seeing him in a new light, one that made him seem less like an invincible titan and more like a man teetering on the edge of something dangerous. I'm not going to just stand by and let them take me, Emily said, her voice steady with newfound determination. I'll fight them. I'll fight for my father. Liam's lips curled into a bitter smile. You don't understand, Emily. It's not that simple. These people, they won't stop until they get what they want. And they'll do anything to make sure you can't fight back. Emily's blood ran cold as his words sank in. What kind of people was Liam talking about? People who would stop at nothing, who would use her as a pawn in their dangerous game of control. She felt a surge of anger that she couldn't trust anyone, that she was caught in the middle of a war she didn't even know existed. I need to get to my father, Emily said, her voice sharp. I need to warn him. We need to leave. We can't stay here. You can't, Liam said, shaking his head. It's too late for that. What do you mean, it's too late? Emily demanded. We can't just, they're already here, Liam interrupted, his tone urgent. They're watching you right now. You're not safe, not here, not anywhere. The tension in the room thickened as the words settled between them. Emily's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. The sense of danger was no longer distant, it was right here, right now, creeping closer with every passing second. The fire was just the beginning. And whatever came next, Emily knew, would push her to the edge of everything she thought she knew. The door creaked softly behind her, and for the first time, Emily felt a cold chill creep up her spine. She turned quickly, but before she could say anything, Liam's hand shot out to stop her. They've found us, he whispered, his voice low and urgent. The world around Emily seemed to pause as the weight of his words crashed down on her. Whatever came next, she knew, would be far more dangerous than anything she had ever faced before. The words hung in the air like a deadly omen, each syllable striking her with the force of a thunderclap. They've found us, Emily's pulse raced, her heart thundering in her chest. She could feel the panic start to rise, a sharp, suffocating sensation creeping into her lungs. She spun around to face Liam, but his expression was no longer the calm, controlled demeanor of someone who had just been speaking cryptic warnings. It was something darker, more urgent. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting toward the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "What do you mean, they found us?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Who is after us? Who's coming for us?" Liam didn't answer immediately. He stood still for a moment, his body rigid with tension, eyes scanning the room like a predator on high alert. His hand twitched slightly, as if he was preparing for something. It wasn't fear in his eyes, not in the way she had seen before, but something else entirely, resolve. He had seen this before. He knew what was coming. "Listen to me," Liam said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "You need to stay quiet, stay out of sight. If they know you're here, they won't stop until they have you." Emily's mind reeled as the weight of his words settled over her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but something in Liam's face told her that she didn't have time for questions. She had no choice but to trust him, or at least, follow his lead. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. Emily froze. Liam's eyes narrowed, and he moved quickly toward the door, pressing himself against the wall as if to blend into the shadows. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. It was like she was living in someone else's nightmare, trapped in a situation she couldn't control. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, a knock at the door. "Miss Harper?" Marco's voice was soft, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "Are you there? We need to talk." Emily's stomach churned. Marco had always been a figure of comfort for her, one of the few people she could trust in the house. But now, with the reality of the threat sinking in, she couldn't afford to be naive. She wasn't sure who could be trusted anymore. She shot Liam a look, and he gave a subtle nod, motioning her to remain still. "Don't open the door," Liam whispered sharply. "If it's them, they'll use Marco to get to you." Emily's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to find some way to communicate with Marco, but she couldn't take that risk. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. Her instincts screamed at her to answer, to reassure him that she was all right, but Liam's warning echoed in her ears. "Marco, we're fine. Go back to your post," Emily said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos inside her. There was a long pause on the other side of the door, then Marco's voice again, softer this time. "I can't do that, Miss Harper. There's something strange going on. Please, come downstairs." Before he could finish, Emily heard a strange rustling sound on the other side. The door handle jiggled once, then fell silent. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Marco's voice had sounded different, hesitant, almost like he wasn't in control of what was happening. Liam motioned for Emily to move to the far side of the room. "We need to go now," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the door. The urgency in his voice sent a chill running down her spine. "What do you mean? What's going on?" she whispered back, panic rising in her chest. She had no idea who was out there, or what they wanted, but she could feel the walls closing in around her. Liam took a deep breath. "I don't know how much longer we have before they find us. But we don't have time to figure it out. We need to move, now star dot." Before Emily could respond, the door suddenly burst open with a force that made her jump. Marco's face appeared in the doorway, but something was wrong. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced with a look of sheer panic. His eyes were wide, and his usually polished uniform was disheveled, as if he had been caught off guard. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then, to Emily's horror, a figure stepped into the room behind him, a man she didn't recognize. His face was cold, expressionless, and his eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Liam moved quickly, positioning himself between Emily and the stranger. "What are you doing here?" Liam demanded, his voice low but full of warning. The man didn't answer. Instead, his gaze flicked to Marco, and the tension in the room thickened. Marco's face twisted in what could only be described as guilt or fear. "Marco?" Emily's voice was shaky, her eyes darting between the two men. "What's going on?" Marco's eyes flickered, but he didn't answer her. Instead, he looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. That's when Emily realized something wasn't right. Marco had always been so dependable, so unwavering in his loyalty to her family. But now, it felt like something had shifted. Liam stepped forward, positioning himself between Emily and the stranger with a kind of quiet authority. "Get away from her," he said, his voice hardening. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. "We don't want any trouble," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. "We just want her." Emily's blood ran cold. The way the man spoke, the way he looked at her, it was as if she were something to be claimed, something to be taken. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who were these people? And why was Marco involved in this? "You're not taking her anywhere," Liam growled, his body tensing as if ready for a fight. The stranger's lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're not here for a fight," he said. "But if you resist, things will get much more complicated." Emily's breath hitched in her chest. The man's words were as cold as his gaze. Whatever this was, whatever game was being played, it was far more dangerous than anything she had imagined. And the worst part was that she had no idea who to trust anymore. The line between friend and foe had blurred beyond recognition. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, just as Emily opened her mouth to speak, another voice interrupted them, this one sharp and commanding. Enough, the voice cut through the thick silence like a knife, and Emily felt the air in the room shift again. She turned toward the new voice, her heart skipping a beat. At the entrance stood another man, tall and imposing, dressed in a dark suit that spoke of power and influence. His face was cold, unreadable, but his presence was undeniable. His eyes met Emily's, and in that moment, she knew, **** was the one calling the shots. The room fell still. The stranger who had been speaking now stepped back, lowering his head in respect. Marco, too, seemed to shrink into himself. "Is this her?" the man asked, his gaze lingering on Emily. Liam's stance didn't waver. "Yes," he said, his voice full of steel. "And you'll have to go through me to get to her." The man's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily felt a rush of adrenaline flood her system, her mind racing. Every moment felt like it was spiraling out of her control, and yet, one thing was clear, the game was only just beginning. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every second dragged on, and Emily's heart beat in her throat, her mind racing with questions. The man who had entered, the one who commanded the room with nothing more than his presence, was studying her now, his eyes narrowing with cold calculation. She could feel the weight of his gaze, like he was peeling away every layer of her, trying to figure her out. Trying to understand her value. "You don't belong here," the man said, his voice low and measured. He wasn't asking a question, he was making a statement. His eyes flicked to Liam, and then back to Emily. "I've been patient. But this game you're playing ends now." Liam's jaw tightened, his body still a wall between Emily and the stranger, every muscle coiled and ready. He didn't flinch. "You don't get to decide when it ends," Liam shot back, his voice sharp with defiance. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something much colder, as if Liam's resistance was an amusing challenge, something to be toyed with before it was crushed. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, the air thick with impending violence. Emily's throat was dry, her mind screaming for her to act, to do something, anything, but she felt paralyzed, caught in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The stranger stepped closer, and Marco, who had remained eerily silent, seemed to shrink even further back into the shadows. Emily could barely recognize him now. Where had the loyal bodyguard gone? The man who had always protected her and her family? Now, he seemed more like a shadow of the person he once was, lost in whatever game was unfolding in front of her. "You don't understand what's at stake here," the man said, his voice cutting through her thoughts like a blade. He wasn't speaking to her, he was speaking to Liam, but his gaze never left Emily. "You've interfered long enough. You think you're protecting her. But what you're really doing is playing right into their hands." Liam's eyes hardened, and for the first time since Emily had met him, she saw a flicker of uncertainty. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there. He was human, after all. He was scared, just like her. But there was something else in his eyes, too: determination. It wasn't enough to make him back down. He was committed to the fight. "What's it going to take for you to understand?" the man continued, his voice a venomous whisper. "You can't protect her from this. No one can." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted between Liam and the man, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. No one can protect her. What did he mean by that? Was it the truth, or was he just trying to break her, trying to make her doubt everything she thought she knew? Liam took a step forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice as cold as the steel in his chest. "You're wrong. I won't let you touch her." The stranger seemed to weigh Liam's words for a moment before letting out a low laugh, like a wolf watching its prey squirm, knowing it had already won. "You don't understand the game you're playing, boy. This isn't about you. This is about power. This is about control. And Emily, well, she's nothing more than a pawn in a game much bigger than both of you." Liam's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles white. "You're wrong. She's not a pawn." But as Liam spoke, Emily felt the truth of the man's words settling into her bones. She had always been the princess in the tower, untouchable, protected, shielded by her father's wealth and power. But now, in this moment, she felt anything but untouchable. She was being dragged into a world she didn't understand, a world where people used others as pawns without a second thought. The man's eyes locked onto Emily, his gaze sharp, calculating. "It's too late, you know. You can try to run, try to hide, but they're already here. They've already planned everything. All of this. It's already been decided." A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. She opened her mouth to speak, to shout at him to leave, but no words came out. She was drowning in a sea of confusion and fear, struggling to grasp what was happening, what she had gotten herself into. "Let's cut the theatrics, shall we?" the man said, his voice sharp and suddenly impatient. "I've got what I came for. And you," he looked at Liam, "you're just a minor inconvenience now." Liam stepped in front of Emily, his posture rigid with defiance. "You're not getting past me." The stranger didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button on it. A soft click echoed in the room, followed by a brief, static-filled hum. Then, the lights above them flickered for just a moment, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What did you do?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Marco, who finally lifted his gaze from the floor to meet Emily's eyes. The look in Marco's eyes made her stomach twist. There was no loyalty left there, no friendship. Only fear. And that fear was all directed at her. "Marco?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's going on? What is he doing?" Marco swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this. But you have to understand. They've got my family." The truth crashed into Emily like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. Marco, her father's loyal right-hand man, the one person she had always trusted, wasn't just caught up in this because of some twisted conspiracy. He had been forced into it. His family was in danger, too. She could see it now in his eyes, the guilt, the shame. She turned to Liam, who was still standing between her and the stranger, but the tension in his posture had shifted. He was watching Marco closely, piecing together the story that Emily was only now beginning to understand. "Everything you've done, everything you've said, it's all been for nothing," the man said, his voice smooth, almost pitying. "You're out of your depth. And so is she." Emily's chest tightened as she tried to process the enormity of it all. It wasn't just about the empire, or her father's business. This was about control, *power star. It was about keeping people like her in the dark, making them believe they were safe, when in reality, they were being played like pawns in someone else's game. But as the tension in the room built, as the stranger's presence loomed larger, Emily realized something deep inside herself. She wasn't just a pawn. She was something more. The only question now was whether she could find the strength to fight back, or whether she was already too far gone. The man's cold smile never wavered as he watched Emily, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, an impatience that had been building with every passing second. Emily felt the weight of his gaze, as if he were waiting for her to make the next move, to prove whether she had any fight left in her. He was trying to provoke her, to break her will before she could even begin to process the enormity of what was happening. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Emily's pulse raced in her ears, every beat hammering with the urgency of the moment. She could feel Liam's presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing reminding her that she wasn't alone. But even with him standing between her and the man, she couldn't shake the growing sense of helplessness that was wrapping around her like chains. "What do you want from me?" Emily finally whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of the question. It was the question that had been gnawing at her from the moment she had learned that her life was no longer just her own. The moment her family's wealth and influence had become a curse instead of a shield. The man chuckled softly, his voice dripping with amusement. "I want nothing from you, Miss Harper," he said, his tone smooth and patronizing. "You're just the key to a much larger picture. A picture you can't even begin to comprehend." His words hung in the air like a puzzle she couldn't solve. But then, something inside Emily clicked. She wasn't the powerless victim in this story. She wasn't just a piece to be moved around. She had a choice, she always had a choice. But as she opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, Liam's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was tight, almost desperate. "Don't," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We can't afford to play into his hands. Not yet." Emily blinked, surprised by his intensity. But as she met his eyes, she saw the same fear that she had felt for herself mirrored there. Fear that everything they had been working for, everything they had been fighting against, was slipping through their fingers. Fear that they were outmatched, that they were playing a game they didn't understand. The stranger's eyes flicked between them, a glint of satisfaction in his expression. He was enjoying this, enjoying the uncertainty, the tension. "You really think you can protect her, don't you?" he said, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you can keep her safe. But the truth is, she's already in danger. And you've already lost." Liam's face hardened, his jaw clenching. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The man took a step forward, unfazed by Liam's defiance. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I've been watching her for years. Watching all of you. And it's been quite the show. But the game is over now. The pieces are already in place." Emily's breath caught. She felt the room spin, the world around her blurring as the weight of the man's words pressed down on her. It wasn't just about her father's wealth anymore. It wasn't just about some business rivalry or power struggle. This was something deeper, something far more dangerous. "I don't understand," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The stranger's smile widened, but it wasn't comforting. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "Like I said," he drawled, "I don't want anything from you. You're just a pawn. But your family, that's where the real power lies. And you're going to help us take it." Before she could react, before she could even process the full meaning of his words, the door behind the man swung open. Another figure stepped into the room, tall, cloaked in shadows, but unmistakable in the way the air seemed to shift around them. Emily's stomach churned as she recognized the figure. It was someone from her father's inner circle, a man she had trusted, a man she had thought was on their side. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. The newcomer didn't speak immediately. He just walked into the room, his presence commanding, like he was the final piece of the puzzle. As he approached, the stranger standing in front of Emily stepped aside, almost deferentially. "Is everything in place?" the newcomer asked, his voice calm, as if he were discussing a business deal. The first man nodded. "It's all set. The plan is in motion. We've done what we needed to do." Emily's heart raced. The plan? What plan? And who is this new person? She could feel the walls of the room closing in on her, each word they spoke tightening the noose around her throat. The newcomer's eyes flicked over to Emily, cold and calculating. "So this is the infamous Emily Harper," he said, his tone disinterested. "I've heard a lot about you." Emily opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. She felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her, the weight of all the lies, the deception, the manipulation. She had been living in a bubble of ignorance, surrounded by people she thought she could trust. But now, everything was crumbling. Everyone around her, Marco, the people her father had surrounded himself with, had been lying to her. And now, it was all coming to light. Liam moved slightly, positioning himself more protectively in front of her. His eyes were dark, filled with something fierce, something almost desperate. "What do you want from her?" he asked, his voice hard with barely contained anger. "Why are you doing this?" The newcomer's lips curled into a small, almost dismissive smile. "Because it's time," he said simply. "Time for the Harper family to fall. Time for the real power to take its place." Emily felt the blood drain from her face as the words sank in. The Harper family, her family, wasn't just being targeted. It was being destroyed. And she was in the center of it, a pawn in a game that she hadn't even known existed. The room fell silent, the tension unbearable. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for her to make the next move. To say something, do something. But Emily couldn't breathe. She was paralyzed by the weight of what was happening, unable to make sense of the twisted web of lies and betrayal that had been woven around her for years. Suddenly, without warning, the lights flickered again, this time longer, the power stuttering as if the building itself were holding its breath. The stranger's eyes flicked to the door, a sharp movement that made Emily's heart skip a beat. And then, a distant sound, a scream, echoed through the hallways of the mansion. The kind of scream that made everything inside Emily freeze. A scream that was filled with pain, terror. Everything changed in that moment. The game was no longer a game. The stakes had just been raised, and Emily realized, the real fight was about to begin. The scream echoed again, louder this time, and the sound sent a ripple of unease through the room. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each beat synchronized with the panic that began to rise in her throat. She could feel the cold chill of fear crawling down her spine. The scream was different from anything she'd ever heard before, raw, desperate. Liam's eyes flashed toward the door, his body tensing, every muscle ready to react. The stranger didn't move. He didn't flinch. It was as if the scream didn't even faze him. But Emily could see the subtle shift in his expression. A tiny twitch of his lip, a flicker of something like impatience or irritation. Whatever this wasn't part of his plan. And that realization made Emily's stomach churn with dread. "What's happening?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely a breath as she reached out to Liam, her hand trembling. He didn't answer at first. His gaze was fixed on the door, calculating, weighing his options. Finally, he turned to face her, his eyes fierce. "Stay close to me. Whatever happens, don't let him out of your sight." Emily's throat tightened, the weight of the situation threatening to suffocate her. She nodded quickly, her mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. But no answers came. The stranger's cold, calculating presence loomed over them, his attention shifting to the door, too, as if he was waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, a loud crash from behind them sent the entire room into chaos. The door exploded off its hinges, splintering into pieces as a group of armed men stormed into the room, their footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Emily's blood ran cold as they fanned out, their weapons raised. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion, the air thick with tension. Liam stepped in front of her, his body instinctively shielding hers. The newcomer, the man who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, didn't flinch. Instead, he stood there, watching as the men approached, his face a mask of calm. "Everything's proceeding as planned," he said, his voice as detached as ever. "It's time." Emily's mind was reeling. Time for what? She barely had a chance to process the words before the armed men began to move toward her, their eyes scanning the room. One of them, tall and imposing, turned to the stranger with a nod. "We've got her." "The mission's complete," the man said, his voice low, like it was a routine job they'd been preparing for. Liam's hand shot out, grabbing the nearest man by the arm with surprising strength. "No! Stay away from her!" His voice was a roar now, filled with desperation, but the man simply shrugged him off. "What the hell is going on?" Emily's voice cracked as she backed away, her legs suddenly giving way beneath her. The confusion was overwhelming. She had no idea who these people were, what their intentions were, or why they were in her home. But one thing was painfully clear, they weren't here to negotiate. Before anyone could react, the stranger's voice cut through the tension. "You can't protect her, boy," he said, his tone icy. "This was never your fight." Liam's face twisted with a mixture of anger and disbelief, but his posture was still defensive, still protecting her at all costs. "What do you want from me?" he spat, his breath ragged. "What's this really about?" But the stranger didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the men who had just entered. "You know what to do," he said simply, and with those words, it was like the air itself shifted. The armed men began to move toward Liam, their expressions hard, focused. They weren't here for pleasantries. Just then, the door crashed open again, and another figure appeared in the doorway. This one, however, was different. The silhouette was familiar, too familiar. Emily's breath caught in her throat as her eyes met the person's. Her father. Her father, who she thought was miles away, overseeing business deals and meetings. Her father, who had never been a part of her world of danger and intrigue. But there he stood, calm and collected, in the doorway of the room where everything was spiraling out of control. He wasn't alone. Behind him, several more men had entered, surrounding him like shadows. But it wasn't the men that caught Emily's attention, it was the look in his eyes. There was something in that look that made her blood run cold. Something that chilled her to the bone. "Father." Her voice trembled as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her father stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Emily, I need you to listen carefully," he said, his voice level, as if he were giving orders, not comforting his daughter. "This isn't what you think it is. Not what I think it is." Emily's words were laced with disbelief. "You're part of this, aren't you? You've been part of it all along." Her father's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and almost apologetic. "There are things happening that are beyond us. Things that we couldn't control, even if we wanted to." Emily's mind was spinning. What was he saying? What was he a part of? And then, like a punch to the gut, the second plot twist came, slamming into her like a freight train. "I never wanted you to be involved in this," her father continued, his voice almost breaking, though he fought to keep his composure. "But I had no choice. We had no choice. It's the only way to protect our family." Suddenly, the room felt too small, too suffocating. Emily could barely breathe as her mind tried to process his words. She had always thought her father was untouchable, a man of immense power who could do no wrong. But now, all the pieces were falling into place, pieces that didn't make any sense. The world around her began to blur, her father's voice growing distant as everything crashed together. Protection, from what? She was drowning in the weight of her own confusion, desperate to understand how her father, the man who had always shielded her from harm, could now be part of the very conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything she thought she knew. And in that moment, everything changed. What had once seemed like a fight for survival had now become something darker, something deeper, something that threatened to unravel the very fabric of everything she believed. Emily's eyes darted to Liam, his gaze now locked on her father. And for the first time, she saw the same fear in his eyes that had been in hers. Whatever had just shifted in the air between them, it wasn't something they could undo. The stakes had been raised, and there was no turning back. Emily's head was spinning, her father's words still echoing in her mind, but everything around her seemed to be happening too fast. The men in the room had paused, and her father, the one person who should have been protecting her, stood there, his face a mask of guilt and something darker, something that made her blood run cold. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "What do you mean, no choice?" Her father took a step forward, his eyes soft but weary. "You don't understand, Emily. The Harper family, everything we've built. It's all in danger. We've been caught in a game we can't control, and there's only one way out of it." His eyes flicked to the man who had been orchestrating everything, the one who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. "They were going to destroy us, take everything we've worked for, but now we have a chance to fight back." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She felt dizzy, like the ground was falling out from beneath her. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but each piece revealed something far worse than she had imagined. You're working with them?" she asked, her voice shaking. "All this time?" Her father didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded, a look of regret crossing his features. "It was the only way, Emily. The only way to keep us safe. If I hadn't joined them, they would have destroyed everything, your mother, you, everything." Liam's hand tightened on her wrist, pulling her closer. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath, his voice the low growl of disbelief. "We've been walking right into their hands." Emily felt her knees weaken as she struggled to understand. Her father, the man she had trusted, the man who had always kept her safe, was involved in all of this. She had thought they were the victims, that they were being manipulated. But now, the truth was staring her in the face. Her father had willingly made a deal with the enemy. She turned to the man in the shadows, the one who had orchestrated everything, the one who had led them into this nightmare. His cold smile remained fixed on his face as he watched the scene unfold before him. "It's done," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "We've won." But just as Emily's heart sank and she thought all hope was lost, something inside her snapped. "No," she thought, "I won't let this happen." She turned back to her father, her voice rising in a mix of anger and desperation. "You think I'm just going to accept this? That I'm going to sit here and let you destroy everything for your own survival?" Her father's face tightened. "You don't understand, Emily. This isn't about us. It's about protecting you. It's about your future." Emily shook her head, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "You don't get it. You've ruined everything. You're not protecting me, you're controlling me." The room went still. The men stood in place, their expressions unreadable, while the stranger's eyes flicked between them, almost like he was enjoying the chaos that was unfolding. But as Emily stood there, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on her, something unexpected happened. Liam moved. It was quick, too quick for anyone to stop him. Without warning, he lunged forward, his eyes locked on her father, and before anyone could react, he grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. "Don't you dare talk to her like that." Liam's voice was low and furious, his grip tightening as he pressed her father up against the cold stone. "You've dragged her into this mess, and now you're going to fix it." Now, for a moment, Emily froze, too stunned to speak. This was the Liam she had never fully seen, the one who was willing to fight for her, no matter the cost. But even as he stood there, confronting her father with all the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, Emily could sense the danger in the air, the tension thick enough to choke her. Her father's eyes met Liam's, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "You don't understand what's at stake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is bigger than you both. You don't know what you're up against." But Liam didn't let go. Instead, he pulled him closer, his voice a growl now. "Then tell us what it is. Tell us what we're really up against." Her father's face hardened. "You'll never understand, but, fine. If you want the truth so badly." He let out a long, slow breath. "The people who've been pulling the strings, the ones who've been threatening us, they're not just after power. They're after something much worse. Something dangerous. The only way to stop them was to play their game. To become part of it." Emily's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Her father's gaze flicked toward the man in the shadows. "They weren't just after your family's wealth. They wanted control of something much bigger, something that, if it falls into the wrong hands, could change everything. This," he gestured to the room, "wasn't about power. It was about control. And I had no choice but to give them a part of the empire to protect you." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the words finally sank in. It wasn't just about the family business or wealth, it was about something much darker, something far more dangerous. But then, just as Emily's heart sank with the realization, everything shifted again. The door behind them slammed open, and another figure stepped into the room. This time, it wasn't just anyone, it was Marco, her father's right-hand man. But his expression wasn't one of allegiance. "It's time," Marco said, his voice sharp. And in that moment, the final twist hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. Marco wasn't working for her father. He was the one who had been behind everything from the beginning. The man who had manipulated her, who had pushed her father into a corner. He wasn't just after the Harper family, he was after Emily herself. And in that moment, everything came crashing down. The truth, the lies, the betrayals, all of it. And as the weight of that realization hit, Emily knew one thing for sure: the game was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The room fell into a heavy silence as Marco's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as the realization hit her with a crushing force. The person she had trusted, the man who had always been there, the one who had stood by her family, Marco, was the mastermind behind the chaos. Her world had turned upside down in the blink of an eye, and she could feel the ground slipping away beneath her. Liam, still holding her father against the wall, turned sharply at Marco's entrance, his jaw clenched in disbelief. His grip tightened, but he didn't move. The reality of the situation hit him too. They had all been pawns, trapped in a game far more dangerous and intricate than they could have ever imagined. "So, this was your plan all along." Liam's voice was cold, filled with disgust. "You played us against each other. You set this up. For what? Power? Control?" Marco's smirk was slow, almost predatory. "It's never just about power, Liam. It's about survival. And you're too late to stop it." Emily could barely breathe as she processed Marco's words. He wasn't just after money or influence, he was after something much deeper. And the real horror was that he had orchestrated the entire thing with one goal in mind: to take control of her life and manipulate her father into surrendering everything. Her family's empire, her future, everything was at risk. She wasn't just a pawn in their game, she was the prize they were fighting over. Her father, still reeling from the shock of Marco's betrayal, stepped away from Liam, his face pale. "Marco, please. This isn't what we agreed on." "We didn't," Marco cut him off with a sharp laugh. "You didn't agree on anything. You were too weak to see what was coming, too slow to make the hard decisions. But I saw the bigger picture. I saw the way the world was moving, and I took action." Emily's mind raced. She had always thought of Marco as a trusted family ally. He had been with them through everything, a steady presence at her father's side. But now, as she looked at him, she saw a monster. A man driven by ambition, willing to tear apart everything for the sake of his own vision. Liam stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not going to let you destroy her." His eyes locked onto Marco's, filled with a quiet fury that Emily had never seen before. "Not after everything we've been through. You want power? You'll have to kill me first." Marco's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You're already dead. Both of you. You just don't know it yet." The tension in the room was unbearable. Emily's thoughts were spinning. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let Marco take everything she had left. But in that moment, something inside her shifted. She realized that she had a choice. She could either stay in the shadows, hiding behind her father's decisions, or she could stand up, face the consequences, and take control of her own destiny. With a deep breath, she stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the tension. "I won't let you control me. I won't let you use my family anymore. You've already taken too much." Marco's eyes flicked to her, his smirk faltering for just a moment. "You think you have a choice in this, Emily? You're just a pawn, just like everyone else." "No," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I'm not a pawn. I'm not your toy, and I'm not your game." She turned to her father, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and determination. "And you've let this happen. You've let him manipulate you into destroying everything we built." "I won't let that happen." The room was silent as Emily's words hung in the air. Her father's face twisted in regret, but it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done. And Marco's grip on her family was slipping. Liam's hand found hers, his touch steady and warm. "You don't have to do this alone, Emily. We'll fight this together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone by her side who cared for her, someone who wasn't afraid to face the darkness with her. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She turned back to Marco, her eyes filled with resolve. "It ends here, Marco." The tension in the room was palpable. Marco's eyes burned with fury, but for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of uncertainty. The foundation of his plan was crumbling, and the power he thought he had was slipping away. But instead of a dramatic confrontation or a sudden explosion of violence, the end came quietly. Emily's father, still in shock from the revelation of Marco's betrayal, finally found his voice. "Enough, Marco. I'll have you arrested. You're done." Marco's smirk faltered, replaced with a look of disbelief. "You think you can stop me? You don't know what I'm capable of." But her father's expression was hard now. "You've been working behind my back for too long. I've already contacted the authorities. You're finished." Marco's gaze flickered, his mind clearly racing, but the reality set in. There was no way out for him now. The lies, the manipulation, the chaos he had created, it was all falling apart. Slowly, but surely, he was losing everything he had worked for. As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Marco's confidence shattered. He knew the game was up. He had underestimated Emily, and he had underestimated her father's resolve when pushed to the brink. "Take him away," Emily's father ordered. His voice steady. The armed men, who had remained silent until now, moved toward Marco, their expressions hard. Marco didn't resist. He knew it was over. In the aftermath, Emily stood there, her heart racing but her mind clear. It was over. The storm had passed. Her father's empire would survive, but it would never be the same again. Emily would never be the same again. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also shown her a side of herself she hadn't known existed, the strength to stand up, the courage to face the truth, and the will to fight for what was right. Liam's hand was still in hers, and she squeezed it, grateful for his presence. In a world filled with lies, deception, and betrayal, he had been her constant, her anchor. And with him by her side, she knew she could rebuild. She could move forward, no longer defined by the darkness of the past, but by the light of the future. As they left the room, Emily looked back one last time, her father and Marco both now a part of the past. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for her future. And in that moment, she realized that the greatest power wasn't in the wealth or the control, they were illusions. The greatest power was in choosing her own path, no matter how uncertain it seemed. And with that, she stepped forward into her new life, leaving the shadows behind, and embracing the future that was finally hers to shape.